from one of America's darkest moments.
Pearl Harbor was devastating to everyone, but it was especially devastating for people who had somebody there.
A family's connection, and 85 years later, a final goodbye.
We never thought this day would come.
Why it did come after 8 decades.
It's been very easy after 84 years to just sweep that under the rug and say, you know, there's no more we can do about that. But they didn't.
And the shocking surprise.
I didn't think that it could be more incredible after going through the discovery that we did, and then to find out that this cousin has also been identified.
What does it mean to bring him home?
It's just an honor.
One family, 2 funerals.
That was a very big surprise to us.
On the long journey home. For generations, their families carried grief and many unanswered questions. Now, as America celebrates its 250th anniversary, this is a double homecoming decades in the making. One that honors service and sacrifice, and a reminder that when it comes to laying our American heroes to rest, it is never too late. At Arlington National Cemetery, on a rainy morning in May, the skies may have been dreary, but for the family of Paul Newton, this day,
It was awe-inspiring.
could not have been more beautiful.
People just came from all over to acknowledge that he lived. And I think someone who died at age 20 could so easily be forgotten.
Especially after 85 years.
But to know that someone in our family was a hero.
Navy Seaman First Class Paul Newton of Romney, Indiana, was serving his country on the USS West Virginia, a battleship in Pearl Harbor. Then came December 7th, 1941. Paul had gotten up early that morning to write his mom a letter.
He said, "I will be home for Christmas." And obviously had no idea that his time was running out.
Rebecca Schmalley grew up hearing about her great-uncle Paul, whose remains were never identified.
And just the sadness in the family of not knowing exactly how he died and where his remains were. That was a big concern to especially his mother. I'm not sure she ever got over not knowing.
And that, it would seem, was that for the next 84 years, until one day last fall when Rebecca got an email from someone claiming to be with the U.S. Navy, a forensic genealogist with news about a relative of hers named Paul Newton. She wanted Rebecca to call her to verify some information.
And I laughed because I talked to my 2 brothers about it, and they both thought, "Oh, that's a scam." But I was curious about it.
So she called her.
And turned out to be one of the best decisions ever.
Paul Newton was among dozens of sailors killed in Pearl Harbor whose remains went unidentified for decades.
They could have just put him in an unknown soldier's grave, and that could have been that.
But in 2017, the Defense Department began the process of sending all those remains to a lab for analysis. In the years since, anthropologists have been using medical records and forensic DNA to finally identify them and send them home.
Dental records, the bone analysis, the comparing to living relatives. It was much more comprehensive than I would have ever anticipated. And that they care enough to continue to do it.
It's how they connected Paul Newton to Rebecca Schmalley.
As it turns out, I'm the oldest living blood relative of Paul.
And that DNA would also determine that Paul Newton wasn't the only Newton in Pearl Harbor on that day that would live in infamy. It set into motion a family connection these relatives never knew.
Wayne grew up here in town, went to Gershmeyer High School.
Wayne Newton.
He's a good guy, family guy.
Was Paul Newton's cousin, who also signed up to serve. As Seaman First Class, he was aboard the USS California, and just like his cousin, Wayne's remains were left unidentified for decades until late last year.
What does it mean to bring him home?
It's just an honor. I mean, to have him come back home and be, especially be laid to rest next to his mom and dad, and it's just an honor to have him back.
His great-nephew Jeff is grateful to the Navy.
Because it's been very easy after 84 years to just sweep that under the rug and say, you know, there's no more we can do about that. But they didn't. They picked it up and took it and were able to bring Wayne home.
And what do you think about that?
I think it's fantastic. I mean, the fact that they did that after all these years, they decided that these soldiers deserved more.
And their families.
And their families, yeah.
One family, two losses, and a generation later, neither side's descendants had any idea about the other.
I don't ever remember my grandfather talking about him.
I didn't think that it could be more incredible after going through the discovery that we did with Paul. And then to find out that this cousin has also been identified and is also going to be laid to rest just a week later is such a joy that they both came home.
Home to a fitting farewell, finally.
Puts an ending to this story.
It's amazing.
When we were putting together this story, one of the questions we had was, what prompted the Navy to finally begin the process of identifying these sailors? For decades, the remains of the unidentified were here in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Pearl Harbor, more commonly known as the Punch Bowl. I talked with one of the forensic anthropologists about the decision to find out who these remains belong to and send them home.
How did this ship's project come about?
So in the mid-2000s, we started exploring the opportunity to disinter a large number of unknown, unidentified remains that were associated with the USS Oklahoma. After the USS Arizona, the USS Oklahoma had the highest number of casualties of any of the battleships that were attacked that day. And we had done some preliminary work earlier that suggested that now with new DNA technology and additional historical investigation, that we would be able to make identifications now that scientists were unable to make back in the 1940s. And so in 2015, we successfully obtained permission to disinter those remains. We brought them into the lab and we began a 6-year-long project to work to identify them. And that project was extremely successful. We ended up ultimately identifying all of the more than 390 sailors that were missing from that ship. And so based on the success of that individual project, we said, okay, now we know that we can go after these other battleships as well. And so that's when I became the project lead, not for the Oklahoma, but for the other battleships. So my project began in 2017, so about 2 years later, with the USS West Virginia. And then the year after that, in 2018, we disinterred the USS California. And so over the years since 2017, the project has continued to grow as we've disinterred the unknowns related to more ships and rolled them up into the project.
Can you explain how you go about your work? I mean, it looks like you're using medical records, forensic DNA.
It is a very, I'll say, very thorough and very meticulous process, right? We owe these missing service members and their families the full measure of our effort to ensure that the identifications that we make are 100% accurate and as fully scientifically rigorous as we can possibly make them. So you're absolutely correct. We use historic records. That's actually where the work begins, is gathering the antemortem medical records on these service members, historical accounts of the incident that might help us understand where particular service members were located on the day. So that can be things like unit records, or on the ships, what the different divisions and companies within the ship were doing, where those personnel might have been. And And then we use, of course, DNA, as you mentioned. That's critical. So we gather all of this information, and that really then is what allows us to say, all right, now we have all the data we need to disinter these unknowns and begin the process of identifying them. Once we do that and we bring the remains into the lab, these remains often, because of the nature of the recovery, back in the 1940s, they are often mixed together. So we have the remains of multiple people in one casket. And so our first most important task is to begin to separate those commingled, mixed remains out into discrete individuals of, individual sailor number 1, number 2, number 3, right, all the way through that entire assemblage. That we do using DNA, of course. Different DNA sequences indicate the presence of different people. But we also do it with a very detailed visual examination of the remains, looking for things like, you have a left and a right humerus. And so in any person, those two elements should be mirror images of one another. And so we can look at left and right paired elements and determine these two match, this third one doesn't match, that matches this other bone from this other casket. So there's a very, very long process of just resolving that commingling and getting these remains separated back into the individuals that they belong to. The DNA testing also then, of course, is vital for determining which of these particular sailors a given set of remains belongs to, right? So we have family reference samples from their living relatives, and our partner DNA lab, the Armed Forces DNA Identification Lab, they're the ones that process all of the bone samples that we send them. They do all the DNA sequencing and all the comparisons that tell us these remains are consistent with the family reference DNA samples of this particular service member. So that's a big part of it. Then, coming back to the medical records, we use their dental charts to compare what was documented in terms of their dental treatments, whether they had cavities, whether they had teeth missing, to compare that to remains. So all of these different analyses are done separately and independently. So when they all converge on the same answer, then we know, okay, we've got it. We're on the right track. These are the remains of this individual service member. And then the last part, the part that my team, we do the segregation and the decommingling of the remains. But then we also compare things like their stature, right? Their height, their age, how old they were at the time they died. So that's also part of the comparison that goes on. Is this given set of skeletal remains consistent in age and height to this particular sailor that seems to be lining up dentally, is lining up with the DNA, right? That's another line of evidence that we want all of those things to overlap and come to the same answer. So that's in broad strokes how that works.
It seems like, there's very much a science part of this, but then there's the humanity part of this. What is it like being on the front line of working to give someone their name back and give that family, their loved one, closure after 8 decades?
Absolutely. I'll tell you, this is the only job that I ever wanted. I was lucky enough to be recruited to come and work here as I was finishing my graduate degrees. And every day it is a profound honor and a privilege to serve this mission. Both of my grandfathers served in World War II, one in the Pacific in the Navy and one in Europe in the Army Air Forces. So, my family was extremely fortunate. They both came home and lived happy, wonderful lives that, allowed me to be here. But there are so many families that didn't happen for. And so, knowing my family's history of service, I feel a profound connection to particularly the Pearl Harbor losses, because that's what led both of my grandfathers to join the service. And so it is my profound honor every day to work to return these men to their families. I was thrilled to see both of the Newtons go home. Their remains were released from the lab both on the same day. And when I know that cases that I've worked on and service members that we've identified are being released, I try to stop into the area in the lab where that's happening so that I can say farewell to them and, sort of wish them fair winds and following seas on the final leg of their journey back home to their family and home to the final resting place that they have always deserved through the honor of their service, and that we finally have been able to provide for them and their family.
And so the important work continues to finally bring them all home. For all of us here at 13 News, I'm Dustin Grove. Thanks for watching.